Well, good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see such a great crowd so early in the day to discuss geopolitics. My name is Enda Curran. I'm a correspondent governor. I am with Bloomberg News. Before I get to introducing our main event today with Professor Dresner, just some housekeeping matters. I want to flag some upcoming events at the FCC. Firstly, I would like to thank Dr. Fung of the Hong Kong University for helping arrange this talk today. Later today, we have a lunchtime talk, if you are at a loose end at lunchtime, on academic freedom in the world of authoritarianism with Dr. Tim Pringle, who is the editor of the China Quarterly. That's at lunchtime today. Then on September 26th, we have a talk with the Deputy Defence Minister of Malaysia, how Malaysia ended 60 years of UMNO rule and what is next. That is on September 26th. So, for today's topic, we're here to discuss the Trump revolution in American foreign policy and the Pacific Rim with Professor Dresner, who is Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a contributing editor at the Washington Post. We all know the backstory since taking office in 2017. Among just some of the foreign policy changes with President Trump's administration has been his decision to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He has triggered a trade war with China. He's launched a new Indo-Pacific strategy. He's had an unprecedented meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, among others. And Professor Dresner will discuss the Trump revolution in foreign policy, how that applies to East Asia, and whether it will endure in any length of time. And just some other final details on Professor Dresner. He has held positions with the Iran Corporation, the US Department of the Treasury. He's had fellowships from the German Marshall Fund, the US Council on Foreign Relations, and Harvard University. His most recent book is The Ideas Industry, How Pessimists, Partisans and Plutocrats Are Transforming the Marketplace of Ideas. Could you all please give a warm welcome to Professor Dresner. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you first to Enda and the Foreign Correspondents Club for hosting me, and also a serious thank you to Professor Courtney Fung, who was the person who arranged this. Full disclosure, Courtney was one of my PhD students at Fletcher a couple of years ago, and real full disclosure, she was one of my favorite students, so it's very nice to see her again. So I've been asked to explain the Trump foreign policy revolution, and let me start by saying there's a real danger in asking a political scientist to do this, in part because as a political scientist or as a social scientist, we are trained to think about this in the notion of, well, clearly let's look at the outcomes. There must be some sort of rational design at work. We have to think about a president as a strategic actor, and of course we also assume that presidents have clear and coherent policy preferences in terms of what they're doing. And I have to say, I'm not sure those assumptions apply all that much to Donald Trump, which is not to say that he's irrational in any sense, but I actually think when it comes to a lot of foreign policy, he doesn't necessarily have clear or coherent policy preferences. He has a few core beliefs, which I'll talk about, but in some ways it's almost dangerous to assume that he functions like a normal politician. Indeed, I have a colleague at Georgetown, Dan Nexon, who has warned, in fact, about something called the analytic normalization of Trump, which is to say, if you try to explain Trump using conventional models of political science, it makes him seem far more normal than he actually is. There's a need to appreciate the degree to which we are really dealing with someone for whom there's a lot of factors that explain Trump, but also it's the fact that you're talking about Trump qua Trump. He's truly, in some ways, the most unique president we've ever had in foreign policy. That said, Trump did get elected on a platform that suggested a foreign policy revolution, and the word revolution is not misused here. The question is, how has he fared as a foreign policy president? Has he actually executed this revolution? And I would say, to be honest, he's been at best mixed in terms of what he's been able to do. I think the nice way to put it is that Donald Trump has been far better at destroying things than creating things. And so there's certain ways in which he's really attacked the status quo, but he hasn't actually put anything in its place. And I think the question of whether he will put anything in its place is largely a function, to be honest, of U.S. domestic politics going forward and less to do with the international situation. So, First, what does Donald Trump represent? You can argue that his election and his campaign represented a sort of strain of thought within America that was a sort of growing sentiment, although never the majority opinion, that essentially a group of Americans that were extremely skeptical of the liberal international order, that phrase that you keep hearing over and over again over the last couple of years. The belief that American foreign policy was leading to nothing but endless wars in the Middle East, nothing but large and growing trade deficits with the Pacific Rim, immigration flows that were causing America to look somewhat less like the America that many people had grown up with, and the belief that allies were somehow free riding off of the U.S. security umbrella, that the U.S. was spending a large amount on defense, which was somehow enabling allies like Japan or NATO to not spend as much. And I think this also dovetailed nicely with a sort of larger secular trend in the United States, which is, I cannot stress enough, the erosion of trust in elites in foreign policy in the United States. The belief that people like me, to be honest, were responsible for things like the unending war in Iraq, the disastrous intervention in Libya, the disastrous non-intervention in Syria, the 2008 financial crisis. And these were things that Trump exploited during the campaign. You know, Trump's primary line when he was trying to make the case for his election was, what the hell do you have to lose? His argument being that things were already so bad that why not me? Why not try, something different? Surely, it can't possibly be worse. And indeed, in the one sort of coherent foreign policy speech he gave during the campaign, he talked about the fact that he wanted to shake the rust off of the foreign policy machine, that he wanted to hire people that didn't necessarily have sterling resumes but had made significant mistakes. And so he really did honestly believe in this kind of sort of new thinking. And I think the other thing that it was a reaction to was Barack Obama. That in some ways Barack Obama embodied many things that a lot of Americans were very suspicious of. Barack Obama was a cosmopolitan. He was someone who genuinely believed in multilateral cooperation. And if we're going to be indelicate about this, he didn't look like a lot of other Americans, and I think Trump exploited that when he was running in 2016. So, what has Trump done in terms of foreign policy? This is where things get a little tricky, because mostly what he's done, as I said, is changing the status quo without necessarily getting much in the way of return. We're all very familiar with the trade wars. I don't need to articulate the various tariffs that he's imposed on allies as well as countries like China. Trump has, I think, genuinely tried to engage in tactical issue linkage as a way to pressure allies into making concessions on trade in other areas. So I think South Korea is the best example of this, where Trump at various points threatened to pull out of KORUS, thinking that would be a way in which South Korea would be willing to renegotiate that trade deal, as well as potentially make more of a commitment to defending against North Korea. There's been a few seeming surprises in the sense of things Trump has done that you wouldn't necessarily have predicted in advance, namely the most obvious being the summit with Kim Jong-un in Singapore, but also the relatively warm relationship personally he's had with both Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. Trump is also clearly believes in the power of diplomacy by Twitter. He was tweeting actively during the campaign, but if you had ever told me that we would find out about breaking news events because Trump would announce them via tweet, I don't think I would surprise you. I'm a very active Twitter user, I will acknowledge that, and even I'm like, good Lord, can you just learn to spell and use proper grammar? But that said, it should also be pointed out that there are large areas where Trump made promises during the campaign to change things, and they haven't necessarily been changed. So the United States is still in NAFTA, and that will probably continue. The United States is still a member of NATO, and indeed, beyond the Sturm und Drang, there are ways in which NATO is actually functioning reasonably well. And when you talk about Trump accomplishments in foreign policy, again, they're mostly negative, which is to say Trump has pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's pulled out of the Paris Climate Change Accords. He's pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. He's pulled out of, I believe, UNESCO and a few other sort of UN agreements. So, yeah, those are accomplishments in the sense that he's changed the status quo. What he has not been able to do is really in any way get the renegotiated or better trade deals that he promised during the campaign. I think the biggest success he can claim to date is the renegotiated Chorus deal, which, if you look under the hood, is actually not all that much of a renegotiated deal. I mean, basically, South Korea agreed to some degree of quotas in terms of steel. They made a token concession on autos, and that was it. And what's telling is that if that's the best that Donald Trump can do with South Korea, which is a country that legitimately needs the U.S. security umbrella, then he's not going to get anything like that from Mexico or from Canada or from Europe. Indeed, on the other hand, there are other countries that are perfectly happy to negotiate trade deals that bypass the United States. I think the Trump administration was legitimately surprised that the TPP went forward without the United States. I think he thought it was going to collapse after that. The RCEP, in this region is obviously potentially going to go forward. The fact that Japan has signed a trade deal with the European Union, the fact that Canada has signed a trade deal with the European Union, you're now actually seeing close allies, countries that are dependent on trade with the United States, basically trying to envision a future without being as reliant on the United States. And in terms of concessions from allies on anything, the truth is, again, he hasn't gotten that much. There's no denying that NATO partners have increased their defense contributions, but they've been doing that since 2014 when Vladimir Putin went into Ukraine. That had very little to do with Donald Trump. I think the best you can say is that despite Trump's bluster and insults and so forth, it hasn't deterred the allies from increasing their defense spending anyway. And then, with North Korea, I think there's no denying that where we are now is probably better than the fire and fury rhetoric of a year ago, but that's damning with faint praise, where if you take a look in terms of what's actually been agreed to in terms of the Singapore Declaration and so forth, it's been almost entirely symbolic, and there's been no actual concrete concessions being made. And indeed, it seems increasingly clear that Trump erred in the Singapore summit by sort of casually agreeing that he would sign a treaty that actually formally ended the Korean War, not realizing the degree to which that was much more important in North Korea, and that they're not going to make any progress on any of their issues before that is dealt with. So how do we explain this? How do we explain what Trump is doing and his relative mixed record of success? I think the first thing to realize is that Trump came in with a fair number of mistaken assumptions about how negotiation works in world politics, and he's only now just beginning to realize this fact. So I think he really believed that the U.S. had serious coercive bargaining leverage vis-a-vis our allies, without realizing that if you are as blunt as Trump is on these issues, you are almost generating the antibodies that guarantee that allies are not going to make concessions. Trump is so unpopular globally, and because U.S. allies are primarily democracies, it's not a coincidence that these leaders are not going to be wanting to make concessions, because if they do so, it'll badly undercut their standing domestically. Not to mention, Trump is the kind of guy that that if you make a concession to now, he's going to come back to you in 2 weeks and demand additional concessions. So your incentive is always to stand fast in the face of this kind of pressure, which I think explains why you're seeing Europe and other countries, Europe and other regions acting the way they are. I think the second Trump assumption, which is fatally flawed, is his genuine belief, his conflation of how countries treat him as a measure of success for how countries treat the United States in terms of foreign policy. So it's not a coincidence that when you ask Trump, what he considers his greatest accomplishments, he would probably list the Saudi Arabia meeting and the China trip. Why? The orb, or the Forbidden City, pomp and circumstance. Because Trump really does believe that foreign policy gets reduced to personal ties. If he gets along well with the leader of another country, he interprets that as a successful foreign policy outcome. And I think that's also, by the way, why he agreed to the Singapore summit. I think he genuinely thought that, if he gets along with Kim Jong-un, then everything else, all the other problems will be solved. So Donald Trump is someone who genuinely does not understand the notion of sort of permanent interests or institutions or so forth. Those things are beyond him. That said, it should also be stressed that Trump has a few core beliefs. He really is a zero-sum thinker when it comes to issues like trade. But beyond that, he doesn't actually have any core beliefs on foreign policy, because he doesn't think that much about foreign policy. I mean, in the last week, with the revelations in the Bob Woodward book, we now know that on Syria, for example, Donald Trump has vacillated between wanting to pull all U.S. forces out of Syria after ISIS was defeated, and then, a few months earlier, apparently wanting to kill Bashir al-Assad, his entire family, and everyone in Syria. I'm going to gently suggest that's a wide range of policy views, and it suggests that really, in some ways, Trump almost thinks about a lot of foreign policy by instinct, which means that his policy preferences aren't necessarily guaranteed to last beyond the next half hour. He can change his mind on many of these things. If anything, I think his two, I said, instinctive moves on foreign policy is, first, he is a mercantilist on trade. That, I think, is a core belief that's lasted for decades for him. And his second question is, the acronym would be WWOND, which is, what would Obama not do? In all seriousness, I think the way in which he actually thinks about foreign policy is, what is something that, like, the common foreign policy establishment would not do? And I think it's, again, one of the reasons why he was enthusiastic about the Kim summit, because no other president had done that or would agree to that. And it's worth pointing out, for good reason would they have agreed not to do that. The other thing that's worth noting, and this is sort of one of those things where it's obvious, although the effects are not as yet clear, is the degree to which Donald Trump has genuinely eviscerated the U.S. foreign policy machine. Which is to say, if you take a look at the sort of Trump's national security team, the burn rate there has been incredibly high. I believe we're on National Security Advisor number 3, Secretary of State number 2. This is not normal in the first 2 years of an administration. The NSC staff has seen, high turnover. And I mean this sincerely. Rex Tillerson was, in fact, the worst U.S. Secretary of State in modern history. I don't say that lightly. It's not but the degree to which Tillerson simultaneously had minimal influence over Trump and nonetheless exercised maximum destructive power within the State Department is genuinely impressive. It takes real work to screw up the State Department even more than it was before, you came into office. At the same time, it's worth pointing out that part of the reason Trump has been able to do the things that he has is that in some ways he inherited a situation in which the checks and balances in terms of foreign policy had been almost reduced to a nub, which is to say Congress in terms of foreign policy exercises almost minimal influence, in part because over the last series of decades, Congress was so polarized and so deadlocked on foreign policy that there's been a slow motion transfer of authority on trade, on war, on declarations of war, and so on and so forth, to the presidency, because Congress recognized that itself could not govern on these issues. So in some ways, the U.S. foreign policy machine over the past few decades was built on the notion that the president would be the last adult in the room. And we now have someone who, how to put this gently, is not an adult. So one of the things I do as a side exercise is on Twitter I have something called the Toddler-in-Chief thread. This is an exercise that basically says, I'll believe that Donald Trump is growing into the presidency when his staff stops talking about him like a toddler. And then it links to a story that generally will cue, usually an anonymous quote, but sometimes on the record, quotes from people who have a legitimate rooting interest in Donald Trump succeeding, nonetheless describing him like a 3-year-old. The sense of, like, we can't control him, or he's, he lost his temper, or the fact that he gets 2 scoops of ice cream as opposed to 1 scoop of ice cream for everyone else at the White House when he has people over for dinner. And this leads to a way in which Trump is genuinely unique, which is, I cannot stress enough Donald Trump's, radical degree of ignorance on foreign policy matters. And this comes through in things like the Woodward book, where he doesn't recognize the notion of, like, pulling all U.S. forces out of South Korea, what that would mean for larger aspects of foreign policy. So in some ways, that's a danger. But the other thing is, and I have a colleague at George Washington, Elizabeth Saunders, who, if she ever comes through, please invite her, because she's really sharp on this stuff. She has made an argument that presidents who don't know much on foreign policy essentially empower their subordinates to freelance far more. Because if you are a Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, and you're dealing with a president who doesn't care or isn't that knowledgeable about foreign policy, it empowers you to do basically whatever you want and spin whatever kind of story you want to the president about how you're really executing his interests. And so that explains things like the anonymous op-ed we saw in the New York Times, or the story in the Woodward book about, let's say, Jim Mattis saying, yes, we'll kill all of the Assad family, hanging up and saying, we're not doing any of that. It basically makes the foreign policy of the United States far less coherent. So going forward, what does that mean? The first is that, the world is going to be tempted, and I think the region is going to be tempted, to essentially wait out Donald Trump. We are almost at the halfway point of his presidency. He's not a terribly popular man. And indeed, what's striking, there's some people who are shocked that Donald Trump might actually get 40% favorable ratings. That's not the way to think about this. The way to think about this is that if I told you, ignoring who was president, that the U.S. economy had an unemployment unemployment rate at 3.8%, growth was higher than the unemployment rate, and inflation was relatively low. And I would ask you, what should the presidential approval rate be? You would all probably answer about 60%. The fact that Trump is only at 40 and going south at this point is telling about the degree to which he is incredibly unpopular. And even if you're a rival like China and you're looking at what the United States is doing, your best strategy right now is to do absolutely nothing. Why should you take active or hostile measures against the United States when the United States appears to be engaging in self-immolation? You just want to stand back and let the U.S. continue to self-destruct. There's no point in taking any steps. Why raise attention to yourself when Trump clearly sucks up all the oxygen? I think the midterms will be a very powerful signal, not just domestically about Trump's political standing, but also to allies and rivals alike about whether or not this is something they have to deal with for the next 2 years or something they have to deal with for the next 6. And that's a huge difference. If you're only talking about 2 years, I can see a scenario where both allies and rivals sort of bide their time and basically sort of, deal with the Twitter tantrums and so forth, but don't really change all that much, expecting that the next president, when they come in, will basically revert back to this, pursue a more restorationist foreign policy, back to the pre-2016 status quo. And it's worth noting here that, and I'll close on this point before taking questions, is that oddly enough, Donald Trump is actually making liberal internationalism great again. And by this, I mean the following. If you take a look at public opinion polls in foreign policy, I'm on the board of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and we conduct an annual poll about what Americans think about foreign policy. And what is striking is that since 2016, on the issues that Trump has clearly, genuinely has core beliefs and has pushed the hardest on trade, on immigration, and on alliances, Americans have moved in the exact opposite direction from what Donald Trump wants. Americans are now much more enthusiastic and see international trade as a good thing. Indeed, in the Chicago Council survey, it's its highest level in 40 years. And if you look at the Gallup polls, it's the second highest in the last 30 years. Americans do not see immigration as a threat to national security, relative to how they thought about this 20 years ago. And Americans are far more positive about alliances than they were even 2 or 3 years ago. So Trump is almost like someone who, it's almost like a boomerang effect. Anything Trump bangs on about, the American public has concluded in the opposite direction. Now, I don't want to say that Trump has had no effect. If you look at Republicans and poll them on this stuff, Republicans have shifted closer to Trump's views. Republicans used to be free traders and they're not so much anymore and so forth. But for every Republican that Trump has managed to persuade, he's managed to alienate 2 non-Republicans. And so in that sense, whoever gets elected president after Donald Trump will be elected with a mandate to essentially erase much of the Trump foreign policy revolution. And the question to ask going forward is, in some ways, how much of the damage that Donald Trump has wrought will be permanent and how much of it will wind up being a scab as opposed to permanent scar tissue. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Well, thank you, Professor. We'll, okay, if we're ready to go, we'll start over in the corner then. Yeah, in the white shirt, please. And please say your name and organisation.
You sit behind me, Enda. It's David Tweed from Bloomberg. I wanted to ask about the logjam that we have in North Korean policy at the moment, because both sides aren't really speaking to each other. They're speaking past each other. They don't agree. You have the Sentosa Declaration, which had 3 main points: unity between the 2 countries, then peace, then working towards denuclearization. Yet you have a whole lot of advisors of Trump saying, oh, no, they agreed fully verifiable denuclearization. We're not going to do anything until we get that. And now we have another summit which is coming up. And it seems that off the record or somewhere along the way, according to reports, Trump did promise something about a declaration for peace or a declaration for the end of the war. So if we do have that summit, and Trump does agree to go ahead with a declaration for the end of the war, and we get some sort of concessions from North Korea, not quite sure what they might be, one would imagine we'll get something, then that would probably represent a significant breakthrough that Trump has actually managed to do despite his advisors. So is there any room for optimism there, that Trump has actually done something positive almost despite himself?
Right. So I would say a few things on this. First, if there was any area where you could argue out-of-the-box thinking might be an interesting experiment, you could argue that North Korea would be it. So in some ways, the North Korea situation is perfectly tailored for Trump to engage in what, for lack of a way of putting it, you can call foreign policy experimentation. And also, because Kim Jong-un is such a singular leader, that's also might be the one bilateral relationship where, if there is a strong personal tie between the two of them, that might actually translate into, more productive or more fruitful foreign policy. That said, if I was a betting man, I do not think you're going to see Trump agree to end the Korean War. And this is based not just on the fact that his advisors oppose it. It's also based on Donald Trump's negotiating history. This is a man who, repeatedly promises he will do many, many things and then does not do them. So the interesting question is going to, and the other thing is that I think it is safe to say that Trump is now wary, I think, of being burned on the North Korea thing. I mean, one of the ways in which one of the interesting things in terms of domestically within the Trump administration that you're seeing is that, Trump ballyhooed the Singapore summit as a great accomplishment and talked about the warm relationship, getting the returns of U.S. soldiers and so forth. But because there's been no progress on the nuclear issue, you are seeing, at least within the administration, a sort of ebbing of power of, let's say, Mike Pompeo as the Secretary of State, who went all in on this, as opposed to someone like John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, who clearly does not think this is a good idea. And by the way, I will say I am enjoying tremendously, far more than I should, John Bolton having to defend, the U.S. summit with Kim Jong-un and the warm U.S. relations with Russia. Because if John Bolton was on the outside right now, he would be like raising fire and fury about all of these things. But that said, you are right that it's possible that if this winds up being something, if you go back to the New York Times op-ed and the Woodward book, there's been a lot of, sturm and drang in the United States about, oh my God, there's an administrative coup d'etat, or, that Donald Trump can't get the things that he wants. I think that misreads how his staffers are dealing with this. As I said before, Donald Trump doesn't have fixed policy preferences. So if you're a staffer for him and he says, let's do this, it makes sense if you're a staffer to wait a half hour or even to wait 24 hours to see, is that really what he wants to do, or is he going to change his mind? So I think in some ways people are mistaking, sabotage for what I would describe as semi-competent staff work. And so in terms of the North Korea question, I suspect that what his advisors would tell him is that you cannot agree to end the Korean War without serious and credible commitments and signals from North Korea that they actually are going to make progress on the nuclear question. And this is in the end the fundamental nub of this problem, which is I cannot see a scenario where North Korea gives up their nuclear program. It makes no sense for North Korea to do that. It makes much more sense for them to string along these negotiations as long as humanly possible, because North Korea has already won. North Korea, Kim Jong-un has already gotten a summit with the President of the United States. That is a huge diplomatic and symbolic victory. And essentially what he's done is been able to crack or end the maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration imposed beginning last year. Because essentially Trump has given carte blanche to Xi Jinping and to Vladimir Putin to, essentially pick up trade with North Korea. So why would North Korea give up any concessions right now? It doesn't make any sense. So my hunch is that in the end, you will not see that declaration. But again, if I knew that for sure, I would not be here. I would be on my yacht. So these are what I call yacht questions, which is to say, if I knew the answers to these, I wouldn't be giving these talks. I'd just be on my yacht somewhere, enjoying a lap of luxury.
Thank you. Richard Ward, Ward Associates. Two questions, sir. The first has to do with Iran. You haven't mentioned Iran today. In the administration, what are the various orbits of thinking about how to manage the Iran relationship, and what do you see as being at stake, and what are the opportunities to make that a more productive relationship? The second one it relates to international monetary and finance conditions, and there's this concern about contagion moving beyond Turkey and Brazil and South Africa. Is this administration at all inclined to or prepared to deal with a deterioration in that sense?
Okay, those are small questions. On Iran, I think the odds of better ties, of like a North Korea sort of reversal in which he asked for a summit, are radically lower and in fact, likely not to happen for a couple of reasons. The first is that Iran is not North Korea. Iran has a domestic politics whereby I don't think Khamenei is not going to agree to a meeting with Trump, and I don't think Rouhani has the political standing to agree to a meeting with Trump. So it's not going to go from the Iranian side. I think the other thing to realize, and I didn't talk about this in the talk, but to be fair, Trump has solidified U.S. alliances in one region, which is the Middle East. So you can argue that relations between the United States and Israel, between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, between the U.S. and the UAE, have in some ways never been stronger. You know, Trump really has bought into the notion that he needs to defend Israel at all costs, and that Mohammed bin Salman is the kind of reformer that he likes. And all of those countries, if they have one thing in common, it's that they don't want to see any kind of, accommodation with Iran. So I think that's the one area where he's not going to move forward without making sure that his ducks are in a row in terms of allies, and they're not going to want to see that kind of warming. And furthermore, this is one of the few areas where I think Trump, in terms of his sort of hawkish instincts, is in line with his national security team. Pompeo and Bolton are equally hawkish on Iran. It's not like they want to cut a deal either. Trump does believe he's a great negotiator, but I think that it would be way too soon to think that he's going to be willing to do a pivot on this. I think he'll want to see whether or not the sanctions, as they're tightened, continue to put pressure on the regime, whether the rial continues to fall, and whether the secondary sanctions against Europe also then have knock-on effects on the Iranian economy. I'm extremely pessimistic that any of this is going to work, but it should be noted that the U.S. sanctions probably will exact a larger bite on Iran than people realize today. It's just not going to be as big as it was, 7 or 8 years ago when the pressure was originally put on. On global finance, how to put this gently, it's adorable, the notion that you think the Trump administration actually is looking that far into the future and is thinking that we need to have sort of, a plunge protection team in place in case things go south. I do think, to be fair, I'm not as concerned about it, in part because I do think the Federal Reserve is paying attention to this sort of thing. And this is an area where Trump has less, the Fed really is an independent actor here. And I think Jay Powell has demonstrated that this is actually something he is interested in. And there was a very sort of not noticed about article, I think, in the FT a couple of months ago, in which a Federal Reserve governor, Randy Kroesner, extolled the notion of international cooperation among central banks, which seems sort of anti-Trump-like. But it demonstrates the degree to which the Fed, at least, is still functioning in much the same way that it did back in 2008. The question is if the executive branch on the Treasury side needs to get involved. This is where I get very dubious. I do not have a lot of confidence in Trump, obviously, and I don't have a lot of confidence in Steve Mnuchin either to be able to handle something like this. I've had too many instances in which I've talked to Mnuchin's former colleagues at Goldman Sachs. It is safe to say that they are surprised that Steve Mnuchin is the Secretary of the Treasury. So I would say I have faith in the Federal Reserve. I do not have any faith whatsoever in the Treasury Department.
So we're going left to right. Keith first, and then...
Hi, Keith Richburg from the University of Hong Kong and formerly Washington Post for a very long time.
Solidarity.
I just wondered, you kind of skipped over kind of the elephant in the White House, which is Russia policy. And I'm just curious, he insults John McCain, he insults everybody, he won't insult Putin. And how do you explain that summit, and what is going on with Trump and Russia?
All right, I'll give you two answers. The first one is damned if I know. I mean this seriously. I mean, this is one of the things that I really loathe about the age of Trump in the United States is that prior to this, I can't stand any conspiracy theory. I find conspiracy theorizing genuinely pernicious as a social scientist. And if you had told me 2 years ago, so do you think that Russia has something on Trump, I would have laughed you out of the room and said, that's absurd, what are you talking about? And I can't do that now. You wind up becoming a little bit of a conspiracy theorist because there's just too much smoke there to wonder what the heck is going on. That said, it should be pointed out that it is very possible that Trump really does believe these things, that he's not doing this for a financial relationship. He's doing this because he thinks that somehow Russia is the key to putting greater pressure on China, actually. In some ways, it's the reverse Nixon strategy. Nixon and Kissinger, when they came into office, pushed détente with China first with the idea that that would then put pressure on Russia, which would lead to greater cooperation with Russia. And to be fair, that did work for a period of time. I think the argument is that Trump sees that in reverse. And indeed, it's not a coincidence that Henry Kissinger keeps talking to Trump about this stuff, and it's Kissinger who actually advocates these kinds of things. But that said, I think the other reason is that, Donald Trump has a fundamentally illiberal personality in the sense of, both during the campaign and as president, Trump is someone who clearly thinks that as president, he should snap his fingers and then something will be done. It's not a coincidence that the measures that he's grown increasingly attracted to, like the pardon power or the power to revoke, John Brennan's security clearance, are unilateral powers that have no, system of review whatsoever. And I think, weirdly enough, he's envious of Putin because Putin does essentially have those kinds of powers as the president of Russia. So I think he admires Putin as someone he wants to emulate, for lack of a better way of putting it. Which, by the way, demonstrates the degree to which Donald Trump is someone who's focused entirely on tactics and not on strategy. Because while there's no denying that Vladimir Putin has had some significant successes in foreign policy as president of Russia, Russia's in a fundamentally weaker position now, I would argue, than they were 10 years ago. They are stuck in Ukraine in a war they don't want to be involved in. They're also stuck in Syria in a war they don't necessarily want to be involved in. And their economy has shrunk due to sanctions and so forth. Which is not to say that they're not going away. I don't mean to suggest that and Putin's personal standing within Russia is higher than ever. But the notion that Russia is a rising power, I think, represents a fundamental misread of what's happening. Russia's a revisionist power without being a rising power, and China in some ways is the reverse. But more importantly, I honestly don't know. I like anyone else, this is one of these things where I will one quick point on this. One of the things I've been very impressed by with the Mueller investigation has been the fact that it hasn't leaked at all. To my knowledge, there has been no story reported out based on a leak from the Mueller team as opposed to Trump's lawyers, which means I have no idea what they actually know. And I think in some ways I'm just going to wait and see what they produce.
Hi, Peter Stein with the Private Wealth Management Association, also a former journalist with the Wall Street Journal.
Wow.
I want to ask you, I want to push you a little bit on the last point that you made, the open question about whether the impact of the Trump administration is a scab that will eventually wear off, or there's lasting damage.
Yeah.
And also on the point that you made about the rest of the world perhaps wanting to just wait out the next few years and sort of hope that things will return to normal. It seems that a lot of the world is actually not waiting it out. A lot of the rest of the world is actually moving forward. And what we've seen with China and the Belt and Road Initiative is that they're going in with lots of money and lots of ideas, investing in places where the U.S. is actually pulling out, like Pakistan, and creating a lot of goodwill along the way, where the U.S. is creating ill will. So I'm just wondering, I want to push you to see, what do you think the lasting damage is? And also, to what extent you think the GOP, and particularly those who are just trying to put the guardrails in place to keep things from spinning out of control, but with this belief that at its core, there are some good things in what Trump is doing. How much do they understand the extent of this lasting damage?
All right, so I'll answer the last question first, which is, I think it's safe to say that part of the reason, I didn't talk about this, but one of the reasons that Trump is having difficulty in foreign policy is that he essentially eviscerated his own bench, which is, if you remember, there were two national security letters that came out during the 2016 campaign, and in full disclosure, I was a signatory to both of them, in which Republican national security officials, the people that you would ordinarily have hired as undersecretaries and assistant secretaries, basically said, we cannot work for Donald Trump. Now, those were unusual, but very often after someone gets elected, you sort of say bygones and you start, staffing your national security team with these people. Trump refused to do that. And there's a way in which I can't blame him, by the way. I mean, again, these letters were pretty serious, although I would argue if you reread them, they've held up. But the point being that in some ways, the GOP national security team remains on the sidelines, the sort of traditional group of neoconservatives and even realists to some extent. So they're fully aware of the damage being done, and I think in some ways it's causing them severe agita. So the question then becomes, how does Trump leave? If Trump loses in 2020, it's worth remembering the last time a Republican president lost after the first term was George H.W. Bush, and you can argue the party has never been the same since then, because basically the lesson they learned from that was George H.W. Bush was a great foreign policy president who compromised with Democrats on domestic stuff, and as a result he only served one term. Let's not do that again. In some ways, if Trump loses in 2020, the lesson will be, so Trump, completely, changed things in terms of foreign policy and pursued this very sort of nasty sort of domestic politics, and he lost after one term. Maybe we should rethink how this goes. And so we'll consider that. On China and the BRI and whether or not they're taking advantage of the vacuum that the U.S. has created, there is a grain of truth to that. Although I think this overestimates the success of BRI. I mean, you're already starting to see stories from Pakistan and from Malaysia, as well as from other countries, where they're clearly having serious second thoughts about what the BRI is going to mean for them. And so I'm somewhat skeptical of whether or not BRI is one of those things that all you have to do is say it in Washington and people start freaking out because it suggests that it's the alternative to the liberal international order. I think this is a case where China's been improvising to be honest, and the interesting question is going to be, in some ways it's a question of learning curves. Does the U.S. move down the learning curve about why whatever Trump is doing is not working and we should probably go back to some previous policies? And to what extent does China learn from its mistakes on BRI and wind up producing a more sophisticated version of it, which really does wind up representing the principles of an alternative order? Unfortunately, if I had to bet, I would bet on China at this point, but you never know.
Okay, we've only time for two more, so one here and then, yeah, thank you.
Mark Michelson, IMA Asia. It's a peer group of executives who run Asian operations for multinational companies. And you might be surprised to hear they're a little concerned about trade. And they've been affected adversely even by the threat, actually, of tariffs because their suppliers aren't selling to them and so on. So I want to talk about trade policy a little bit more deeply. It seems to be, and tell me if I'm wrong, it seems to be sort of bipartisan in the United States. So no matter what happens in the election, and even I'd argue President Obama, although he sort of moved toward a more open trade view toward the end in TPP, he really wasn't instinctively in that direction. What do you think, no matter what happens in the election, is this kind of approach going to continue? And also, does this affect, it's often been said that one of the aims is to decouple the U.S. from China economically, at least to one extent or another. And finally, you've mentioned before, the lack of people in positions in commerce as well as in state, especially having to do with Asia. Is this having an impact as well?
So again, I'll answer the last question first. The lack of Asia hands is a problem. It's a serious problem. There's no there are very few competent people who know anything about Asia serving in this administration. And I think, to be fair, it's also frustrating the Chinese. I mean, you're seeing reports. Traditionally, over the last 20 years, the way that China has handled U.S. policy or foreign policy with the U.S. is they want to pick one key interlocutor that is their go-to person. So it was Henry Paulson, when he was Secretary of the Treasury. It was Tom Donilon when he was National Security Advisor, or Jim Steinberg when he was Deputy Secretary of State. There is no one like that in this administration. In some ways, it is Donald Trump, unfortunately, because you never know when he's going to be mercurial and sort of change his mind on something. So that is a big problem, and I think that it's not going to go away, because even if they bring in a top-notch China person, the question will always be, how much rope does that person have to negotiate deals, as opposed to, until it goes to Trump. On the trade question, so there's a split answer here. As I said, Americans are now actually far more ardent free traders than they were even 5 years ago. And this is one of the more interesting sort of public opinion phenomena that you can describe. And I think the most interesting poll on this actually was, so very often the way that you can do it is you ask Americans, well, do you like free trade? And they'll be yes, but then do you like fair trade? And they're like, yes, we definitely want fair trade. So maybe they're not as committed to it. But there was an interesting poll when the steel and aluminum tariffs were announced. that CNN ran asking Americans, do you think, it is worth pressuring allies to get a better trade deal? And this was something where I would have expected a majority of Americans to say, yeah, we care more about the economics of it. 60% of Americans opposed it. They said that relations with alliances is more important than trade. That's a telling fact. The fact that Americans, when they're asked to equate these two things, care about the alliances more, suggests that they're not as committed to mercantilism as people like to say. Now, this is where I think you do have a point. The exception is China. The reason is that Americans are approving of trade with allies. With adversaries, they start looking at it in a more relative gain situation, and therefore there is bipartisan support for a tougher approach with China. That said, this might be one of those areas where if there's no agreement with Trump and there's a new president that comes in, you can see the makings of a deal actually being negotiated. Because to be fair, China recognizes that they are going to have to make concessions. Indeed, they've moved in that direction, on both intellectual property rights and more significantly on foreign investment in China. So, they're not unaware that in some ways they've also been the midwife of this problem. Donald Trump in this sense is a symptom rather than a cause on this, because the degree of animus in the United States towards China on the trade question has been rising for quite some time. So yeah, there's bipartisan, enmity on this, but I can also see a situation where you wind up, negotiating agreement. And in terms of the global supply chain question of whether you're going to cut China out, this again gets to the question of, do you think Trump will be around for 2 years or 6? Because if it's 2 years, whoever comes in as president is going to revoke a lot of these tariffs because they'll have the authority to do that. And you wind up, there'll be trade tensions still going forward, but it's mostly a lot of smoke and mirrors. If you know this is going to last for 6 years, though, then that's when you might start suddenly rethinking the global supply chain question. Although, again, the issue here, and this is the indelicate one for Americans, is that America is not the largest market for China at this point. It's still the European Union. And so the question is, do you really want to rework your global supply chain for a secondary market? And I'm not sure what the answer to that is. And not to mention the fact that Trump's notion that somehow we'll bring the supply chains back to the United States is A, grounded in fantasy land, and B, grounded in a misplaced understanding of an economy functioning like it did in the 1950s as opposed to now. Which is to say, even if Trump could snap his fingers and bring all of these manufacturing supply chains back in the United States, it would not generate any jobs, or it would generate a piddling number of them, because manufacturing is largely an automated enterprise at this point. And that's the thing, that Trump has no conception of what sort of technological change does to an economy as opposed to trade.
And just finally, if you could be brief, if possible.
Oh, sorry, that's my fault. I keep rambling.
Thanks very much. Michael Kurtz, I'm with Raise Capital. It's a hedge fund here in Hong Kong. A bit surprised to hear you not mention the National Security Address last December and the recharacterization of China from strategic competitor to strategic adversary. And I'm hoping that you might just offer some comments on the degree to which that change in the way we characterize the relationship with China may or may not be justified by behaviors like the cyber attacks and the expansion in the South China Sea. Thanks.
The reason I didn't mention it is because I'm not sure it matters. Think about what that there was the National Security Strategy, which was a coherent document, which was unusual in that it's the first national security strategy I've seen in 50 years that took great pains to rubbish previous national security strategies. Mostly it's been continuity, but that one actually said, well, the previous ones were wrong, here's the new thing. But the other thing to remember is that Donald Trump himself, when he introduced the national security strategy, gave a speech that was fundamentally at odds with the content of the national security strategy. He said very nice things about Russia and China in that speech. It was not thinking of China as a strategic, adversary. And so, to be fair, if you're China looking at this, I would be confused, because it's not clear who's running, the foreign policy railroad on this point. That said, again, in some ways it's a continuity with the last question. I do think future presidents are going to look at China with a warier eye than you had during the Obama years, or the George W. Bush years, or the Clinton years, which is to say, China is simply, it continues to be a rising power. And what's interesting is the degree to which rhetorically now Xi Jinping is making statements that make it clear that he thinks the Chinese path to development is a viable model that others should copy. That language from the third plenum was new. Previously, and I wrote a book about this, that previously China had largely kept its head down on these questions and was perfectly willing to buy into sort of the U.S.-led order. The more that China acts like a revisionist actor, the more that national security strategy will matter. But as I said, if you're China at this point, as frustrating as it is to deal with this administration, you do want to ideally, sort of settle these trade deals. They're not going to be taking terribly aggressive action because why poke a bear that's eating off its own arm? It's pointless. Just let them keep eating off their own arm.
Okay, at this point I need to present Professor Dresner with the FCC notebook and an FCC tie. Could you all please give a warm thank you to Professor?